Hello, I'm Derek Olson, president of WorldOregon, and we are officially kicking off today's program for YouTube viewers later and those who are zooming in for us today. Today's Great Decision talk is on pandemic preparation, lessons from COVID-19, and the challenges of global health governance. This is with Professor Chunhuei, who is an excellent, knowledgeable presenter who spoke for us several times, and during the pandemic. He's very knowledgeable. I really commend his past programs, which are up on our YouTube channel, should you be interested in it. This goes along with the pandemic preparation article, which I hope many of you had a chance to read in Great Decisions booklet. And, we're thrilled to be partnering with Oregon State University and the College of Health to benefit from Professor Chi's expertise. He'll be giving a presentation with some great slides, and then we will do our usual Q&A, where we will mix in questions from the audience and questions from online. And as a reminder, if it's not on a mic, people online can't hear it. So we'll be sort of strict about that only questions into the mic after the talk. So without further ado, we're thrilled and honored to have Professor Chi here presenting today.
Thank you, Mr. Derek. Good afternoon. My name is Chunhuei, as Derek already introduced, and also happy Valentine's Day. You must be very thrilled and enthusiastic about pandemic to spend the Valentine's Day to hear this talk. So today I'm going to share with you my knowledge and observation over the pandemic. I acquire a new expertise that I wasn't intended to, but the situation just forced upon me that I had to constantly update my knowledge and information. And throughout the pandemic, I got a total of over 430 media interviews, both nationally and around the nation. And so part of the information I'm sharing with you were accumulated through those preparation of media interview. I told my student, each media interview for me is like an oral exam. Why it's like an oral exam? Because whatever I said, if it got printed or online, most of them become permanent public information. So I have to do my homework for each interview. That also helped me to accumulate those information. So today's topic is about pandemic preparation and what lesson we can learn. And I'm going to share with you some of the information I probably one of the very few scholar or expert hold that idea that the media were not very interested. So there are 5 parts. First part, how did we ended up with the catastrophic pandemic that could have been averted, prevented. And that's a view. I am the lone voice. I keep emphasizing this pandemic could have been prevented. But if we don't understand, don't study why this could have been prevented, we are bound to make the same mistake again and again. And then briefly talk about the 3 phases of the COVID-19 pandemic and control policy, how they varies. And then also briefly talk about transitioning into the post-pandemic era. And the 4th part, the collateral damage of the pandemic and control policy, that has been the subject of my study over the last entire year. I conducted 6 countries that including US, Chile, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan to study how those 6 countries' pandemic control policy impacted their society and economy. So our focus was not on health. That was well studied, but our focus was on that collateral damage. And then the last part, we will talk about the world after the pandemic. So let's start with the first. I like this analogy. How many of you ever heard about the Bhopal disaster? Very good. That has been, so to date, the world's worst industrial disaster. And I use that as an analogy. That disaster could have been prevented. So when Union Carbide built that chemical pesticide and fertilizer plant in an urban area, there's a lot of doubt and concern. But Union Carbide assured the Indian government and local residents that they have exactly the same plan in Texas, and they use exactly same safety standard. In addition, they assured them they have 3 redundant safety equipment that prevent disaster like this from happening. And before they start operation, they even show that for a disaster like that to happen, all 3 redundant safety devices have to fail at the same time. And they even calculate the probability, and you have to multiply the probability of each of the 3 failures. And the probability resulted in 1 in several million. That's nearly impossible. But something nearly impossible happened, become 100%. All 3 devices failed. I will not get into too much detail. So I'm using that as an analogy for how we got into this pandemic. In a similar analogy, there are 3 safety kind of devices or institutions. First, warning from country of origin, the World Health Organization dramatically expanded international health regulation. That was in place for decades until 2003 SARS, when China did not disclose the nature of that contagion and tried to hide it for 6 months and lead to the smaller scale of pandemic. Unfortunately, WHO at that time was far more competent and averted a major global pandemic. So because of that lesson, they expanded the international health regulation in 2005. The idea is no new epidemic like SARS should happen again. Yet it happened again. So that IHR failed. So this is the first layer of safety device that failed. Again, China failed to inform, not only failed to inform the world, but also tried to hide it, not only from the world, but also from its own people. And they hid it at least 4 months. And I will share with you later. So the first safety device failed. Then we have second safety device, warning from the global health governing body. That's the WHO, World Health Organization. Unlike 2002-2003 WHO, which was very competent in and assertive in sending independent investigative team into China to identify the contagious nature of SARS. This time, the WHO, at least for the first 6-7 months, I criticize is totally incompetent. And WHO is, I attribute half of the responsibility for the global pandemic. The other half lies in China. So WHO failed to collect correct, timely information and continue to delay the declaration of pandemic until March 11, when it's way too late. So the first 2 devices failed. That leaves us the last one at the national border. And we all know what that happened to this country and numerous countries. And I will share with you that experience. So from the beginning of those media interviews, I was the lone voice, keep emphasizing this pandemic could have been averted had those safety devices were checked in place. So this was the lesson we learned from 2003 SARS. I highlighted in red font. So China hid it for 6 months. The virus that caused SARS was SARS-CoV. The virus that caused COVID-19 is the same family, SARS-CoV-2. They're very close family. But this is a big difference. The SARS mainly transmitted by droplet and high reproduction rate, meaning the transmission rate, and very few asymptomatic infection. So these are somewhat different from the COVID-19. But the importance of facial masks happen to be the same in terms of prevention. So that's a quick cap on how we got into this mess, this catastrophic disaster. So next, section, I believe we introduced the 3 phases of the COVID-19 pandemic and control policies. So I started construct this timeline since the first year. And every year on average, I have to update twice because things got evolved. So I highlighted some of the important dates. The first reported case, this is by published medical journal by Chinese epidemiologists. They reported as early as November 17, they collected patient sample. But China, or more specifically, it's the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. So the CCP, until January 16 of 2020, in its last press conference before acknowledging the nature of the disease, on January 16, still lied to the world, say, we don't have evidence this disease is contagious. But its epidemiologist has been collecting patient sample as early as November. And interestingly, it's the Chinese epidemiologists through their publication in medical journal that provided 100% solid evidence China was lying. And there's another major publication in the 2 top journal, Lancet and New England Journal of Medicine, using the same sample, 425 patients. In the method section, they stated we started collect patient at the beginning of December 2019. And so when researchers started collect sample in November, that means they knew about the transmission no later than October. You don't start design a research the first case you found. You start to design a study when you found a substantial case. And WHO also lost another opportunity. Taiwan, not even a member of the WHO, was the first country to report to the international health regulation about the emerging contagious. At that time, there was no name, just emerging contagious disease going on in Wuhan. And unfortunately, WHO ignored that. And partly, that's just my guess, the leadership didn't want to offend China. So they ignored that. And look at Taiwan was the first nation to report to IHR and also the first nation to mobilize because Taiwan was burned by SARS. And similarly, Vietnam, Singapore, those were the nation that took early action because those countries were burned by China in SARS. January 20 was the first day finally China, the CCP, acknowledged this disease is contagious. And just 4 days earlier, China was saying, we don't have evidence. And the totally incompetent WHO repeated every word China said. Hours after January 16, China's press conference, WHO also in its press conference say, we don't have evidence this disease is contagious. 4 days later, they finally acknowledged that's already too late. And it took WHO nearly 2 more months to declare this as an emergency, as a pandemic. And so I use the 3 phases within the pandemic. Mainly, the first phase is prior to vaccine. So the second phase is post-vaccine. And that post-vaccine is not only vaccine, but that time, the health officials and researchers have a much better idea about the virus and the disease. Also, researchers already come up with effective treatment. So by phase 2, we not only have vaccine, we also had effective treatment and know how to prevent it. And that helped us to move to the phase 3 transitional. By transitional, meaning transitional into post-pandemic. And WHO declared the end of the pandemic in 2023, May 5th. President Biden also declared the end of state of emergency that was declared at the beginning of the pandemic. So the state of emergency related to pandemic ended for the US May 11, just less than a week after WHO declared that. So these are roughly timeline. And there are some attributes, I'm not going to too much detail, I already explained some of the key issues. And the pandemic control strategy varies because as we move on our researchers were very good at coming up with new evidence. But just like every field of science, when we are facing a new phenomenon, in this case, new disease, we started with blinded. We have little to no knowledge. And some of the early studies turned out to be wrong. And this happened several times. And one of the most notable was the New England Journal of Medicine in March 2020 published an experiment showing how the virus are resilient on different surfaces. The virus can remain vital and contagious up to a week. And since then, everybody was rushing to wash everything. But that research was overturned in June by another group of researchers, and they found a big flaw in the New England Journal of Medicine research experiment design. In that experimental design, the researchers, they spread high density of the virus on different surfaces, and then they observe and test over a week period. In real life, that never happened. So in June, they tried to replicate what in real life is likely to expose to the density of virus that's shaded by an infected person. So they model that after the realistic quantity of viruses on different surfaces. And the result is totally different. On a real life, realistic situation, the virus will not survive more than 3 hours. And most surfaces are no longer contagious after 1 hour. But some government, some agency didn't follow this new research. They didn't update their information. So some of them still recommend people to detail and follow washing throughout the pandemic. So that's just one example how it's challenging to keep update to the emerging evidence and knowledge, and something you found to be true turned out to be wrong. And that's the nature of science. And I summarized 4 models of how countries respond. Sweden was alone. Initially, most scientists criticized Sweden, but Sweden chose that route with some scientific knowledge. That turned out to be correct by the phase 3, herd immunity. What Sweden didn't do correctly was it figured that it's extremely difficult to prevent transmission. And given that younger and healthy people, they have very small probability of developing severe symptoms or death if infected. So the herd immunity idea, at that time, there was no vaccine. So the idea was to let young, healthy people infected. So we acquire herd immunity, and this epidemic will be gone. But Sweden didn't do enough to protect its elderly and vulnerable population. And in the early stage, resulted in highest deaths per million population in Europe. So for that, Swedish strategy was being criticized, but the underlying science turned out to be correct. It's just that you have to do it in the right way. And then most countries fall into this group: slow response, early time. And part of the slow response, WHO is accountable because WHO delayed the declaration of pandemic until March. And so that missed the golden opportunity to mobilize, to prepare. And that's how most countries follow WHO's lead, that they didn't quickly respond. And by the time they try to respond, it's too late. They resulted in lockdown. You might have seen those footage, particularly in Italy and in New York. But most countries were in this group, largely influenced by WHO's incompetence. And then a few countries, particularly USA, Brazil, and Russia, in the initial months, denial. And some of you might remember at that time, President Trump said this whole pandemic is a hoax that created by the Democrat to undermine his re-election campaign. And he repeated that 2.5 months until mid-March, after WHO declared it's a pandemic. He finally acknowledged this is real. But many of his followers didn't hear that or read that their leader already changed his perception about the nature of this disease. Unfortunately, throughout the pandemic, we don't have accurate statistics, but a very rough estimate, between 10 to 15% American persistently think this whole pandemic is a hoax. And those people would never wear masks, would never get vaccination. Why? There's no point. There's no pandemic. Why should I wear mask or get vaccinated? And Brazil had a similar experience, and Russia in the early time too. And then the last group selected, including Taiwan, Singapore, South Korea, Vietnam, New Zealand, Australia, Iceland, Chile, and numerous Pacific Island countries. They took a very early preparation and early mobilization. So they were able to hold very low deaths per million. That's the metrics I measured. So these were the model countries in terms of pandemic preparations. In phase one, contact tracing, accurate testing, isolation, quarantine are the effective tool, even though there's a social cost to it. But this was before we had any vaccine or effective treatment. And when facing a highly contagious and early stage lethal too, this turned out to be a very effective prevention measure. And this is a statistic comparing the cases and deaths throughout the world. And throughout the pandemic control, there's a trade-off about individualization of risk versus socialization of risk, and trading protection of privacy versus protection of public policy. And those trade-offs are complex. There's no easy answer how society should balance between those trade-offs. And just quickly on Taiwan's early success, that the January 2nd mobilization was unusual, considering at that time their ruling party was facing a very contested general election, the presidential election and parliamentary election. And few ruling party facing that fiercely contested campaign could spare the attention and energy to an emerging disease that's still not very few information, but Taiwan did on January 2nd. That's quite remarkable given the political situation. And these are key pandemic control policy Taiwan implemented: information system and contact tracing, with strict isolation, quarantine, mostly on border control, and mask mandate. And there's an important issue about mandate. The health authority or government cannot mandate something that's not available. And the reason Taiwan could do mask mandate because Taiwan quickly mobilized and accelerated the production of masks. And Taiwan was the first country in the world to have universal access rationed masks. And given that the government is capable of distributing masks to every household, therefore government can mandate. And of course, the US, like most other countries, in the first few months, there's extreme shortage of masks because China produced about 90% of the world's supply of masks. And China already stopped exporting masks long before it declared the disease was contagious. And here are some highlights of Taiwan's success. From late April 2020 to January 2021, for 8 consecutive months, Taiwan had 0 domestic cases. All the cases were quarantined because they were imported. And that also led to many people who were tired of stay home, moved to Taiwan or migrated to Taiwan during that time. And I visited Taiwan during that time to teach an in-person class because OSU was entirely, for 1.5 years, entirely online. I get to teach on-campus in-person classes. And I have to stay in a quarantine hotel for 15 days before I can go out. And I met so many international scholars at that time, moved to Taiwan. And I also heard in Silicon Valley alone, there were over 3,000 engineers moved to Taiwan. Since they work online, they might as well move to a place you can live normally. And the online work, you can do that anywhere in the world. And that's remarkable. Taiwan never locked down. So that year, Taiwan is probably one of the very few places on earth that the Fountain of Opera could perform in front of live audience. They did in Taiwan. And on New Year's Eve, Taiwan held the world's largest gathering. Over 70,000 people gathered for a concert, New Year's Eve concert, live. Now let's look into the transitioning into the post-pandemic. So we already talked about the three phases. In the transitional one, an important factor that helped us into this transitional era was the mutation of the virus first discovered in South Africa, but South Africa was not the origin. It's simply they discovered that first, the Omicron and its family, the subvariant. And Omicron represent a very different nature of the virus from the original. Now, in the literature, people refer to that as the Wuhan strain, the original strain. So by the time if the mutation lead to the Omicron, it become far more contagious, at the same time, far less lethal and less severe, and approaching the nature of flu. It's not similar with flu yet, but very close, because in its mutation, it adapted 3 genes from the regular common influenza. And those nature were discovered first by University of Hong Kong Medical School on December 15 publication. And then in January, early January, a big team between US and Japanese researchers further confirmed that nature. So they call that the endgame virus or the variants, because that changed the whole pattern of the pandemic that lead us to the phase 3, the transitional. And national health system plays a very important role throughout the pandemic. And also during the pandemic, particularly 2021, when we start to roll out the mass vaccination, it exposed the long-term underdevelopment of US public health infrastructure. And so the initial rollout of the vaccination, many parts of the country face chaotic processes. And that just exposed the underdevelopment, underinvestment of public health infrastructure. And this is the estimated excess deaths per 100,000 people during the COVID until January this year. And this is the latest evidence, which still consistent with the early evidence, that the case fatality rate among the young population are extremely low. But as you go older, this study did not include 670 and older, but other study did include that, particularly 80 and older have much higher case fatality rate. And that's confirmed, I mentioned about Swedish herd immunity approach, that if you're able to protect the elderly and the vulnerable population, that's an appropriate approach. And when the vaccine rolled out, we also faced the vaccine politics, the vaccine nationalism, a country holding vaccine for its own citizen residents, but also there are anti-vaxxers. And together with that disinformation and misinformation about vaccine, vaccine diplomacy, China was the first country to develop vaccine. No surprise, because they knew all along, much earlier than other country. They get a head start. And China was very eager to use vaccine diplomacy, because China want to change the narrative from being the origin of the pandemic to the savior of the pandemic. And that through the vaccine diplomacy. But also we observe vaccine inequality, that generally middle low-income countries have harder time to access vaccine. WHO and Gavi, which is the Global Initiative for Immunization and Vaccination, join hands to create this mechanism, try to equalize the access to vaccine between rich and poor countries, but without too much success, largely because of the vaccine nationalism. And here I did an interesting calculation. In terms of the confirmed deaths, the excess deaths, meaning, for example, Africa has the world's 16.72% of the population, but they contribute only 3.88% of the world's COVID-19 deaths. But look at Europe, as 9.78% of the world population contribute 31.28% of the deaths. Similarly, North America, 4.73% of the world population contributed 24.33% of the deaths. So this is the discrepancy in terms of the proportion of the population versus proportion of the death. The CDC, you might remember in 2021, when CDC rolled out the mass vaccination, one of the promotional information CDC asked was, everybody should get vaccinated. Even if you recover from an infection, you should get vaccinated, because the vaccine-induced protection or immunity is stronger than the natural immunity, meaning the immunity you gain from recovery. But then in 2020, later 2021 to 2022, CDC did its own study on the two large state population, California and New York, follow up 6 months. And this is the result that with, I summarize its result here. This is easier to see. So CDC has to change its statement. The strongest immunity comes from fully vaccinated plus natural immunity. That's the strongest. But then the second strongest is a natural immunity. And the natural immunity provides stronger protection than the vaccine-induced immunity. So CDC has to change that statement. And this was the study I mentioned from University of Hong Kong Medical School about the nature of Omicrons, showing that high reproductivity in the upper respiratory tract, but very low reproductivity in the lung. So it's the Omicron and its subvariants ability to damage our lung is far smaller than all previous variants. And that explains why the Omicron and its all lineages are highly transmissible, but far less severe and lower fatality. And this is another study I mentioned by the bigger team, the US and Japanese team, confirmed that study. Chile, the only high-income country in South America and only country of the OECD countries, has world's around third largest population vaccination rate. And it did a very thorough track. And that also provide further evidence about vaccines' effectiveness in preventing deaths and severe symptoms. Unfortunately, so far, our vaccine has not been very effective in preventing infection. That has to do with the complex nature of the virus. But fortunately, still, no matter what kind of variants mutation we face, our vaccine are still highly effective. And this is one of the strongest evidence from Chile's national population follow-up studies, that if you keep up to date with your vaccines, the fatality rate or severe symptom rate are far less than either no vaccination or just one incomplete vaccination. Last year, 2023, and actually 2022 to 2023, most of my media interview will focus on China, because China was the last country to hold on to zero COVID. And on the 9th of December 7, 2022, it's literally one man's decision. Chinese leader decided to reverse 180-degree reverse from a strict lockdown to completely relax of all control measures announced on December 8 in the morning. And the absurdity of that was, on the day it announced total reversal of the pandemic control policy, most provincial capital were still in the process of constructing mega quarantine hospital. By mega hospital, this hospital ranging from 10,000 to 20,000 beds. Now they are all obsolete, because they use them to quarantine people. So this was the cover of one of my interview by the Guardian. And this is how, when that announced, most Chinese people feel it was all for nothing. That how come the day before it was strict lockdown, and in less than a day, completely reversal. And during the pandemic, I developed this chart to summarize what are the factors help us to end the pandemic, and what are the factors contribute to prolonging the pandemic. So the bottom, the pink boxes are the factors that will prolong the pandemic. The top, the green boxes are the factors that help us end the pandemic. Now, let's move to the fourth part on the collateral damage. There are obvious ones: economy, education, mental stress, including suicide, depression, domestic violence. The domestic violence, especially in the US, got much worsened because of the double factors. People stay in home, no place to go, and that create more stress and more opportunity for domestic violence. At the same time, most shelters were closed because of the pandemic. So that makes the whole situation much worse. But then there are also less obvious ones. Intersectional inequality, meaning the inequality across income, race, age, gender, etc., that all got worsened. And there's excess mortality and morbidity from other disease. For example, one of my close friends' father, who before the pandemic had an early stage of cancer, he was supposed to follow up, but because of the pandemic, even though Taiwan did not lock down, but because the concern about infection, he delayed, postponed for about 7 months to his necessary follow-up. After 7 months, it was too late, and he died shortly after. So this is an example of people not dying from the COVID-19 itself, but people in regular time, people have other health conditions. But because of the pandemic, it limited people's, even without lockdown, people are concerned about being infected. So people's kind of self-imposed restriction. And so there are excess mortality and morbidity from other diseases. Of course, human relationship, we become more isolated. And all the cultural activity, religious service, traditional celebration, these are important in binding society, but were suspended. So the society become more divided. And democracy and human rights also suffered. And then, of course, the alternative fact, misinformation. And when people are vulnerable, they are more likely to believe conspiracies, and that a fertile ground for misinformation. And then unemployment and the the suffering of unemployment were not equal. For example, the leisure and hospitality suffers the highest rate of unemployment. And the violence against women not just happened in the US, but this is the global statistic. Everywhere in the world, it happens during the pandemic. Remote education. This is the chart comparing the national income versus accessibility to remote education. And so you can see the lower income, you have higher proportion of the students have no access to remote education, which was why in the summer 2020, the first year, UNICEF urged all countries don't close your campus. Keep your campus open because remote education for many countries equals no education. And this was put in the UNICEF website to show what remote education looked like in Africa. Last year, there was a big national study in the US published assessing the impact of pandemic on education. And the report concluded that the impact of suspended school remote education result in equivalent of all students in the US losing 1 full year of education. And this is international comparison of unemployment. And international inequality also, after decade of improvement, got worsened because of the pandemic. At the same time, pandemic also create profit opportunities. So the super rich got even richer, and US is here, Russia, Sweden, and across many countries, the super rich got much richer. So we have to ask the question, who were most adversely affected by the pandemic? Also, when do the costs of pandemic control outweigh its benefit? As early as summer of 2020, still in the first year, this was an international survey across over a dozen of countries, shows quite consistently on the orange, people were more by summer 2020, people were more concerned about economic risk than health risk, including the US. So I summarized the 3 types of casualty related to COVID-19. The first type, casualty of COVID-19, meaning you infected, either died or have a severe symptoms that's directly caused by COVID-19. The casualty from COVID-19 is like my friend's father. He wasn't infected by COVID, but he has an early stage cancer. But because of the pandemic, he was concerned about being infected. He delayed, postponed his screening and treatment and died. So that's an example of casualty from COVID-19. The last one is casualty from COVID-19 policies, particularly countries with extremely strict control like China, hold on to its lockdown and zero COVID policy. And you might remember in the fall of 2022, very unusual mass protests happened throughout China because people were fed up of the lockdown. And what stimulated that mass protest was in Uyghur area. The news broke out that there was one apartment with fire, but because the apartment was under lockdown, the resident cannot get out. Over a dozen of residents burned alive because of the lockdown. So that's an extreme case of casualty from the policy. So given that there are casualty related and related to the COVID-19 and from the policy, this leads to the rationale. We cannot let the pandemic continue. I call it to hijack our life and work. Because the control measure also have cost to society. And we have to weigh the cost and benefit. There's also pandemic fatigue. So this was from one of the articles. Do pandemic ever end? And the declaration of the end of the pandemic is largely a political assessment of socioeconomic and political costs. So where do we go from here on the last part? This happened in January 18 to 19 in Wuhan, China. I immediately download available because China blocked Google, but they can jump the firewall to access Google. So many Chinese people were proud. This has been almost a decade-long new tradition in Wuhan area, the world's largest potluck dinner that coincided with Lunar New Year. That year, no, the date, 18 to 19, because on January 16, their government still declared we don't have evidence this disease was contagious. Had those people knew there was something serious transmitting in Wuhan, they would never help this over 40,000 people gathered in a potluck party, the world's largest potluck party, a perfect ground for transmission. After China finally acknowledged the contagious nature of the disease, all those pictures were taken down. And I saved them in my drive. And these are evidence of why I criticize the early months of WHO being incompetent, because the Director General couldn't praise China enough about its effort. So what went wrong? Already mentioned, WHO ignored the critical warning from Taiwan and ignored non-government sources, given China initially did not disclose of the highly contagious nature, which contrasts to 2003. China did the same thing, didn't want the world and its people to know SARS was going on, but WHO sent independent investigation team as well as relying on non-government information. But this time, all WHO did was simply repeat every word China said. So here, the New England Journal of Medicine, this is 100% solid evidence that China lied to its people and to the world, because this group of Chinese researchers in the meta section of this first article, New England Journal of Medicine, said 425 confirmed cases they collected started in early December 2019. And there are more. This is just another example about began stockpiling PPE months before the declared outbreak. Lancet Commission, if you're interested, you can read the whole report. They published the lesson for the future about the COVID-19. I highlighted the red one, the lack of timely notification of the initial outbreak, and the poor enforcement of appropriate level of biosafety regulation in the lead up to the pandemic. And in the first year, China used its influence, tried to pressure most medical journals not to investigate the alternative source of the virus, focusing on nature source. And that has a chilling effect because people, researchers who want to investigate the human-made source virus, they have a hard time to publish their articles. And that conspiracy and strategy was discovered in 2021. And so there was a group of scientists, because in 2020, with China's influence, about 16 scientists signed a letter published in Lancet asking everyone not to question the source of virus other than nature derived. And that has a chilling effect throughout that year. But the following year, 26 scientists from around the world signed another letter published in Science, criticizing the original letters, that without evidence, how can you be so sure that this virus was from the nature? And they asked to be open-minded to investigate the true source. There's also politics of COVID-19 pandemic control, particularly solidarity, political trust. And then I highlighted the global health governance and its failure. So I already mentioned, when should we start letting the pandemic hijack our life? And as we move forward, I already mentioned about the collateral damage. So we have a lot to repair: our society, our economy, our human relationship. In addition, we are facing the new public health and global health because this pandemic exemplified the failure of our global health governance. And the global division of labor shake-up, particularly China being the world's factory, turned out to be unreliable because it's rampant lockdown and makes car, computer, and other electronic parts supply disruption. And so more and more companies are moving their supply chain out of China. In 2022, Apple announced that within 10 years, right now, all Apple's iPhone, Apple Watch, iPad, and computer were made in China. But they have a 10 years plan that 10 years later, the world supply will be coming from India. And they scaled down China's manufacturing to focus only on domestic for the China market. So the world, in 10 years' time, you will getting your iPhone and iPad from India rather than from China. And it has nothing to do with politics per se, but just for business, that China was not a reliable supplier, the way it handled the pandemic. And there's also pandemic-oriented strategic plan. And we actually are facing a much bigger challenge that many of those factors are relevant to climate change. And we also need to systematically strengthening for a more resilient health system, particularly the United States, the long-term underdevelopment, underinvestment of our public health infrastructures. And we also need to build a more resilient society, and including an interesting new notion called social vaccine that emerged during the pandemic. One of my colleagues from Australia was the lead author on this idea of social vaccine, and focusing on 4 areas: life with security, economic security, and opportunities that are fair, and this is planetary health, and then justice, governance. And if you're interested, you can read the more detailed paper they published. And the CDC also come up with global health security agenda. They no longer put total confidence on WHO given the failure of preventing this pandemic. So CDC is taking its own initiative. President Obama in 2014 introduced and implemented a global surveillance system for emerging communicable diseases. And in 2015 spring, in a press conference, he introduced and talked about this surveillance system. He just randomly pick a year. He said, we need this global surveillance system. Maybe in 5 years' time, we may encounter a major outbreak. But unfortunately, that whole surveillance system was ended when Trump took office. And we also face the challenge, particularly the bigger challenge of climate change. Do we have a common future? Do all countries, rich and poor, facing the same challenge, same cost, same resources, same consequences? The global economic impacts also affect the supply chain earlier I mentioned, and its disruption of the global division of labor. One impact on the pandemic was because of the state of emergency restricted human rights and freedoms. And so Freedom House, as well as The Economist in their 2022 report, both commented that one of the casualty of the pandemic is the regression of freedom and democracy. And this came from an interesting book about the emergency state, talking about the emergency state is ignorant and opens up opportunity for corruption and is self-reinforcing. Earlier, CDC and WHO was openly telling a lie. Some of you might remember in the first several months, CDC and WHO tell the public, don't wear mask. Wear mask will not protect you. And they reversed that statement by summer, WHO by summer, CDC by fall. And so they were criticized. Why did you tell public a lie? So this was an article analyzing that. And they argue that as a public health authority, you should never lie to the public. And particularly CDC's lie has a long-lasting effect, because for the first few months, CDC told the public, don't wear masks will not protect you. By the fall, when CDC reversed that statement, there were many people objected using their own word to criticize CDC. But you said CDC wearing masks will not protect us. Why do you want us to wear masks now? Even though they explained it was out of good intention, the reason they lied to the public was shortage of masks. But this article, these authors argue that as a public figure, public official, we should never lie to the public about the science. And you will pay price for lying to the public, even in an emergency. So the coronavirus challenge open democracy, as I already mentioned, through those restrictions. So we are in need of improving governance during a crisis. And those green box factors are the one can strengthening the governance. In the yellow one, they're weakening the governance. These are the lessons we learned from this pandemic. Likewise, the global governance facing a big challenge in the future, particularly how can we face climate change? That's a much bigger challenge than the pandemic. Everybody is talking about resilience. We need a resilient society, resilient health system, etc., and resilient economy. But to think about resilience, we also have to think about for whom, for what, and in what dimension. And this is my personal reflection and idea. To make our system, our society resilient, we need compassion, but we also need innovation and adaptation so we can adapt to new challenges and new changes. And the implication we learn from this pandemic is balancing saving life and livelihood is extremely important and complex. And improving governance during an emergency has long overdue. We ignore that for too long. And improving social and economic resilience. Finally, a Canadian philosopher has a review about the historical society responses to challenges. And he summarized there are two patterns how society react to challenges. Either hanging together and to facilitate more innovation together to face the challenges, or hanging each other, meaning competing for limited resources. And that's conclude my talk, and I'm welcome all comment and questions.
Thank you very much, Doctor, and excellent and challenging presentation. We have limited time for questions, so we'll take the first couple we have in the audience, and then if we have any online. So raise your hand if you have a question, and I'll come get you.
Simple question. What do you attribute the low levels of COVID in Africa?
That's a good question. Yes, many researchers were perplexed about low fatality rate from the COVID-19. So there are multiple factors. One is demographic. Africa, in terms of population, are very young. And as you saw the statistics, young generation, even if infected, generally has very low fatality rate. And which also explains why North America and Europe has unusual high number of fatality, because both continents have very high aging population. So that's one factor. The second factor is Africa is far less urbanized. And so people are less congested on average. A third factor is Africa's both health system and societal resilience. For over a century, Africa have been fighting more lethal, more contagious disease. So they already have a lot of experience dealing, coping, and encountering contagious diseases. So each of those three, I think, are important factor contributing to Africa's, despite they got very small portion of the vaccine, still they have a low fatality rate.
Additional questions?
What can we, especially in the United States, do to fight disbelief in science, particularly the anti-vaxxers, especially when science changes and advice changes and people sort of throw up their hands and don't believe anything?
That's a $1 trillion question. But the issue, the challenge, and US is not alone. Many countries face the similar challenges of misinformation, disinformation. And the challenge has to do with diversification of the source of information. That prior to the present day internet, most people rely their information from a carefully reviewed, vetted information source, either from newspaper, radio, or TV. In general, those journalism did a very good job in vetted their source, their information. But since the age of internet, that all changed. And that makes people more inclined to search, to watch, to read the type of information they want, they like. And so we lost that opportunity of the shared vision, the shared information, and we have diversified information, and on top of that, misinformation and disinformation. And I don't have an easy answer for that. The key issue is how can we talk with each other instead of diving into only our own comfort zone in terms of the information. And without that opportunity, without that cross communication, the society is just going to get further and further divided. And I'm really concerned of that. And now think about AI can generate fake video with real person. And that's the power of spreading misinformation and disinformation.
We have time for one last question. If anyone has a question, then I will take the opportunity to pose one. Where do you see, is there specifically something scientists are concerned about, whether that's flu or some new version of COVID, or in addition, in the aspect of preparing in general, but is there any specific sort of threat that scientists are focusing on as the next likely pandemic?
No, we don't know where it can come from, but we just have to keep alert. And an important one is sharing information. Given the WHO's international health regulation failed, and there has been a review and examination last year, but they ignore a major cause of the failure. When you have a country extremely powerful like China choose not to follow the rule, there's nothing the world can do about it. And so that leaves us to build our own network of trusted partners to do surveillance, that we have to build that network. And for example, US has built a long-term network to share information with Taiwan's CDC. And Taiwan, in this case, Taiwan was the first country outside of China to know about what's going on in Wuhan area. And Taiwan actually shared that with the world. And that's an important lesson, that we cannot rely on WHO, and particularly ignoring, as I mentioned, how and why this pandemic could have been prevented and it failed. And without paying attention to those factors, I'm pessimistic about WHO's ability to prevent another pandemic. So we have to rely on our local community, our government, and international partner to build that network, which I mentioned CDC currently is doing. CDC, that Global Health Security Network, has about 70 countries join hand. And so I think CDC also recognized the weakness of relying on WHO. As I mentioned, the most country had a slow response, largely because of WHO's slow response. They trusted WHO, and WHO failed them to take an quick early response.
Please join me in thanking our speaker. See? A quick thank you to Portland State University for hosting us here. And remember, we'll see you in 2 weeks. We are no program next week. We'll see you on February 28th. Thanks so much.